I've unearthed a Jack the Ripper connection to the famous bagel shops in the East End of London. I did a YouTube short the other day about the closure of one of the two main traditional bagel shops on Brick Lane. Shorts had to be less than a minute long, but that was fine, it was just a minor point of interest. But little did I suspect that there was much more to this entire story than initially met the eye. And yes, I can also introduce a Jack the Ripper angle to it. I had quite a bit of interesting feedback from a number of correspondents, which gave me food for thought. And this time, I'm not referring to cream cheese bagels or one of their slices of cheesecake or even one of their donuts. And I have much more to tell about murder and Jack the Ripper even. But before we get into some of the sinister and yes, disturbing details, I'll dive into a bit of East End social history. As this film has worldwide distribution, I wondered whether to call it Jack the Ripper and the Curse of the Bagels, spelt B-A-G-E-L. But I thought I'd go for authenticity and use Beigel, B-E-I-G-E-L, the unique spelling that's been in use in the East End for 150 years. The word bagel comes from the Yiddish Beigel, B-E-Y-G-L, which is obviously closer in spelling to the Brick Lane way, which in turn comes from the German Beugel, which means a ring or a bracelet. The nearest word in English is bow. A large wave of Jewish migrants left Eastern Europe from the 1880s up to the early part of the 20th century, mainly from territories then controlled by Russia. They spoke Yiddish, which is a form of German with other minor influences, but it was written in Hebrew characters. The overwhelming majority of those that left Europe by sea landed first, at least temporarily, at the docks in the East End of London. Most went on to America or the rest of the world, but some obviously chose to settle in Britain, and most of those stayed in the East End. In the East End, Jewish Yiddish speakers who naturally used the Hebrew alphabet rendered the word Beigel, B-E-Y-G-L, for their bread roll into Latin characters we use for our alphabet, and they spelt it B-E-I-G-E-L, and it stuck. Logically, this must have been the earliest westernized spelling due to how Jewish migration from Russia proceeded. Later, elsewhere, when it was translated from Hebrew to Latin characters, it was spelt Beigel, B-A-G-E-L. I've no doubt that when in Russia, Jews from, say, Lithuania might pronounce bagel with a different accent compared to Jews from, say, Bessarabia. There were certainly different dialects, but I don't think these different accents carried over, as these slightly different original communities would have become very mixed up. The East End Jewish pronunciation was and is Beigel, B-Y-G-E-L, as opposed to the more normal pronunciation bagel, which you'd say was like B-A-Y-G-E-L. How this happened, who knows? Beigel is more phonetically correct, and so is likely to be the more authentic way of saying it. But I've never heard a non-Jew say Beigel, although I have actually been corrected on this, so you know, it's a controversial subject. And I've been going to this shop for 40 years, and prior to that, I probably didn't even know what a bagel was. So I can only have learnt my pronunciation from the East End, and I say bagels and not beigels. It's a bit like scones and scones. Non-East End Jews in London and elsewhere tend to say bagel, and I believe they slightly look down on Jews who still pronounce it as Beigel, as it implies a more recent East End and so poor old-fashioned lineage. As I said, it's a controversial subject, and I'm certain that some people will disagree with everything I've said so far on this subject, as it attracts arguments just as ripperology does over suspects. Talking of which, a few years back, after local Jack the Ripper meetings, a group of us on a semi-formal basis used to visit Bagel Bake, and we called ourselves the Bagel Club. We even had to expel one member for gross treachery. So it was a serious business. Luckily, the shop that closed wasn't the one that we patronised. Indeed, I've never even used the yellow shop. That's another strange factor involving these shops. Regular users tend to use one or the other and never mix and match. So what's the history of these two shops? The yellow bagel shop at 155 Brick Lane claims to have been there since 1855. There were no doubt bagel shops existing in the East End going back maybe 150 years, but the yellow shop only seems to have dated from the mid-1960s, when it was part of a three-shop East End bakery empire run by somebody called Johnny Cohen. He brought his brother Asher Cohen, who was actually a carpenter, over from Israel to help him run his shop on Brick Lane, the yellow bagel shop. Asher then rented the shop from his brother Johnny and successfully expanded the business, to the extent that Johnny then wanted it back for himself. As family relations deteriorated over business, a not uncommon occurrence in that community, a nearby butcher's shop came on the market as the owner retired. In 1974, Asher bought the butcher's, which was at 159 Brick Lane, and turned it into another bagel shop that he now owned. That was Bagel Bake. No doubt delighting that he was in direct competition with his brother just a few doors down. The shops became great rivals. However, in 1987, the bagel shop, the yellow one, was brought out by another Jewish family. It is this shop that closed in February 2024. And there remains conflicting stories as to why that happened. Is it for repair work, or was it because it's repossessed? A repossession notice was affixed on the door, and someone claimed it was a fake and someone stuck another label over the top of it. We will see, but in my opinion, the notice was genuine. But to return to Bagel Bake, the one I patronise, Asher died in August 2016 at the age of 81 and passed his highly successful business onto two of his sons, Nathan and Daniel. A picture of Asher still stands behind the counter in the shop looking over the customers. But this is enough Yiddish History Month material. We now move into a sinister and very disturbing direction. There was a third, younger son, Joshua, who was 27. Joshua had worked in Bagel Bake with his brothers, but he had to leave as he was rude and aggressive to other members of staff and to the customers. Then, when his father died, Joshua was cut out of the family business altogether. This led to further friction, and Joshua was imprisoned in Wormwood Scrubs for a short sentence after he assaulted members of his own family. At the beginning of August 2017, as probate was granted on Asher's will, which had made his brothers directors of Bagel Bake, Joshua was released from jail. Thereafter, Joshua had to live in a converted garage at the rear of the family's house on Golders Green Crescent in Golders Green, a well-known, largely Jewish district in North London. He was banned from the £2.5 million, six-bedroom main house unless his brothers were there. Although his mental health was known to be very poor, he was released without medication. A member of the community psychiatric team called on the 9th of August, but no one was in and there were no follow-up calls. At 8 AM on Friday, the 11th of August 2017, Joshua approached the main house. His sister, Hannah, aged 33, was doing some hoovering in the sitting room, and his recently widowed and disabled mother, Leah, or Louise, aged 64, was in her downstairs bedroom. She slept downstairs due to a knee injury. Joshua knocked on her bedroom window and he somehow persuaded Leah to let him into the house. Exactly what happened next, no one knows for sure, but some of the details were caught on CCTV cameras. Joshua first visited the downstairs toilet and then went into the kitchen, followed by Hannah and Leah. All three of them then went to the basement laundry room, but only Joshua came out. In that laundry room, Leah suffered 13 stab wounds to her head, face and body, and was bludgeoned over the head, causing a traumatic brain injury. She also suffered cuts to her hands and arms as she desperately tried to fend off Joshua's frenzied attacks. Hannah was stabbed in the neck with her carotid artery severed and would have died in seconds. 2 large kitchen knives and an iron meat tenderizer were used. The wound to his sister is suggestive that he killed her to get her out of the way quickly. The wounds to the mother are suggestive of extreme overkill, resentment and a negative mother complex. Joshua Cohen emerged minutes later with blood on his head and legs, carrying bloodstained clothes upstairs. He changed into a red hooded top and grey tracksuit bottoms and left the house. A neighbour who didn't want to be named said he saw Joshua Cohen soon afterwards on that Friday night. He was wearing a big red hooded fleece with a logo on it and grey tracksuit bottoms and was headed towards a tube station, which is where other people said they saw him wandering around. At about 9 PM, Nathan Cohen came home from a shift at Bagel Bake. He wanted to watch the second half of an Arsenal football match, so he went up to his room to watch it and have a shower. On his way up, he noticed that the kitchen was a bit messy. Soon after, he came back down and realised there were red footprints on the kitchen floor. At first, he didn't realise what he was seeing, probably because he was in shock. He saw the trail leading to the basement, where he found his mother and sister lying in a pool of blood. Nathan immediately called for an ambulance. The police also came and found 2 large blood-stained kitchen knives in the kitchen bin and in the basement. The blade on one was chipped in the attack on Leah, leaving the tip embedded in her head. That illustrates the force used in the attack. A neighbour described the scene as a bloodbath. Joshua was arrested at 2 p.m. the following day in the nearby Golders Hill Park after a tip-off from a member of the public, and he was charged with 2 accounts of murder. Soon after, Joshua Cohen was sent to Broadmoor as he was deemed to be mentally unfit to enter pleas. He was diagnosed with having paranoid schizophrenia. After a while, Joshua's mental health improved and he was brought back to the Old Bailey, where he entered guilty pleas to the manslaughter of his mother and sister by diminished responsibility, but he denied their murder. The Crown accepted this plea following psychiatric reports, and Joshua Cohen returned to Broadmoor under an indefinite hospital order. Obviously, this is a very disturbing and sad story, but what is the Jack the Ripper angle? I will say only one word: Kosminsky. Aaron Kosminsky is the favoured Jack the Ripper suspect for those who have faith in a couple of senior policemen based at Scotland Yard. Kosminsky's generalised madness was the primary reason for his status as a Jack the Ripper suspect in the eyes of those senior policemen. Melville McNaughton, second in command of the Criminal Investigation Department at Scotland Yard from 1891, wrote, "This man became insane owing to many years' indulgence in solitary vices. He had a great hatred of women, especially of the prostitute class, and had strong homicidal tendencies. He was removed to a lunatic asylum about March 1889. McNaughton's boss, Robert Anderson, repeatedly referenced his favourite suspect's madness, and here are a few examples. It's impossible to believe they were acts of a sane man. They were those of a maniac revelling in blood. He has himself a perfectly plausible theory that Jack the Ripper was a homicidal maniac temporarily at large, whose hideous career was cut short by committal to an asylum. One did not need to be a Sherlock Holmes to discover that the criminal was a sexual maniac of a virulent type. Major Arthur Griffiths, the Inspector of Prisons, who was basing his knowledge on the opinions of McNaughton and Anderson, wrote, "One was a Jew, a known lunatic who was at large in the district of Whitechapel at the time of the murder, and who, having afterwards developed homicidal tendencies, was confined in an asylum." After Anderson's death, his son wrote his biography, in which we can find the following passage: "The criminal was a sexual maniac of a virulent kind, living in the immediate vicinity. The police reached the conclusion that he and his people were aliens of a certain low type, that the latter knew of the crime but would not give him up." We can clearly see that to Anderson in particular, Kosminsky's guilt was intrinsically linked to his evident madness. He killed because he was mad. And Aaron Kosminsky was literally mad. On the 12th of July 1890, he was taken to Mile End Old Town Workhouse on Bancroft Road due to his deteriorating mental health, but was released a few days later. On the 4th of February 1891, he was readmitted and was certified as insane as a person of unsound mind and a proper person to be taken charge of and detained under care and treatment. He declares that he is guided and his movements altogether controlled by an instinct that informs his mind. He says that he knows the movements of all mankind. He refuses food from others because he is told to do so, and eats out of the gutter for the same reason. He took up a knife and threatened the life of his sister. He says that he is ill and his cure consists in refusing food. He is melancholic, practices self-abuse. He is very dirty and will not be washed. He has not attempted any kind of work for years. The next day, Kosminsky was sent to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum in North Middlesex. It was noted that he was no danger to others and his disorder was listed as mania. He was extremely deluded and the duration of his existing attack was given as 6 months, which was later corrected to say 6 years, which conforms more with the previous note that he had not attempted any work for years. In 1894, Kosminsky was transferred 15 miles to Leavesden Asylum in Hertfordshire, where he eventually died in 1919. I will draw attention to the reference to Kosminsky threatening the life of his sister. That issue probably provoked his family into having their brother committed. There are obvious parallels with the Joshua Cohen case. The family in both cases knew they were dealing with someone who was mentally ill for a number of years. In Kosminsky's case, they had him committed before he could do anyone any serious harm. In the case of Joshua Cohen, in the era of care in the community and neglectful community care teams, because that was the finding, there were tragic consequences. Most of those who favour Kosminsky as a suspect contend that he was schizophrenic based on their own less than expert diagnosis. And the modern theory is that he murdered during temporary lucid moments. This is because if he was mad while killing, he could not have persuaded a victim to go off alone with him, as his madness would have been obvious. Also, and perhaps more significantly, he would not have acted in a stealthy manner. They kill on impulse with little planning, as was clearly the case with Joshua Cohen, a diagnosed paranoid schizophrenic. Also, Kosminsky would not have put any thought into escape and evasion. He would have been caught straight after the first murder, just as happened with Joshua Cohen. The very factor that appealed to Anderson as suggestive of guilt, Kosminsky's madness, has to be denied as being a factor involved in the murders. So Kosminsky must have been a psychopath as well as being a schizophrenic, and must have murdered during a lucid moment when he was not seized by his schizophrenia. The killer, known as Jack the Ripper, must have been able to put his targets at their ease, particularly the later victims when the whole of London was on high alert. He must have had his wits about him. The murders took place in some of the most densely populated areas of the entire country, with beat policemen and vigilantes patrolling the streets in large numbers. He needed to avoid getting blood on himself. He needed to get back to wherever he was living without being apprehended, and he successfully did this repeatedly. Based on what we know of Kosminsky from the period, from Anderson and his medical records, he could have no more become a serial killer than could have Joshua Cohen. Schizophrenic killers are not stealth murderers. They don't plan their escape. They kill and get caught more or less immediately afterwards. They are unheedful and careless of their own security. Joshua Cohen killed, left the house and sat around in the immediate neighbourhood awaiting capture. That is fairly typical of schizophrenic killers. At the time of the Jack the Ripper murders, the police, the press and society at large had a strong belief that an overt madman was likely responsible for the crimes. They could not have been more wrong. The reality is that an overt madman, a lunatic, could not have been responsible for these crimes. We know that now, or at least we should do. Combing the registers of insane asylums was and is a total waste of time. This does not just apply to Kosminsky, but to any suspect proposed on account of their overt madness in any capacity. But in Ripperology today, we still see people engaged in futile hunt the lunatic exercises. You literally find people who say, "Look at my suspect, he must be taken seriously as he went to an insane asylum." And of course, you'll see some people agree with that assessment like they're in a 140-year-old time warp. Serial killers are indeed mentally ill, but they tend to be psychopaths, and they are a totally different beast. They're not overtly mad and pass amongst us largely unnoticed. And that is what makes them so dangerous and chilling. They're seemingly normal, ordinary. They hide in plain sight. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and share, like, comment below and ring that notification bell.